over to Peter to finish up with some initial thoughts.
Thanks. Well, I'm happy to say that I think off the back of what Caroline has just suggested, I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle, and I'll leave the tech understanding to a younger generation, if I may. Just off the back of Paris, really, what got me thinking was really all the big kind of policy shifts and levers that need to adapt and evolve if we're going to achieve anything like the ambitions that were laid out in Paris, or indeed anything like the ambitions that were laid out when we agreed the Sustainable Development Goals. So sometimes I think we think of governments very much as legislators. I think they think of themselves as legislators and regulators, but actually government has far more power than it often is willing to use. So just a couple of thoughts really from me in terms of how it can use its softer powers. And that's not necessarily by passing, new legislation, but it is about using and adapting things like the tax system. The current government have really undone a great deal of, progressive, positive tax incentives, particularly when it comes to things like climate change and energy. And so the first thing that we need to do is take a 180-degree U-turn and go back in the direction from where we've come, and actually re-incentivise markets, investors, to put their money back into the sorts of technologies and innovations that have been emerging now in our country over the last 20, 30 years in things like putting photovoltaics on school roofs, which lower the costs of fuel for schools, but also reinvest profits back into tackling fuel poverty and actually achieving our energy needs in a sustainable way. So certainly there are simple things like using the tax system for environmental gains, but also for socially progressive businesses, whether they be businesses that are paying the living wage, encouraging business to adopt those sorts of policies by reducing the cost of national insurance for those businesses that sign up to those sorts of schemes, would be a very, very simple thing actually that the government could do, and actually would not cost it nearly as much money as many people may think. The second thing really is around advancing the metrics and measurement. And actually we have to understand the full impacts of transactions and business and investments on the world if we've got any chance of making decisions to reduce them. And there has to be the skill and the intellectual capacity within our society to develop much, much better metrics than the current kind of blunt tools we use like GDP, which continually drive us in paths which are fundamentally unhelpful to our own futures and indeed our own survival. And then the third thing is really around public procurement. Governments around the world still spend around 40% of GDP. This is a huge amount of money. They are powerful consumers and customers, and yet about 80% of all government money is still spent with the same old 50 or so companies. There is no room in government procurement for small businesses, for social businesses, for local SMEs. All the money is swallowed up by multinational outsourcing providers that are heavily invested in lobbying and influencing. Many of our parliamentarians are shareholders in some of these biggest outsourcing companies, and that relationship needs to be blown apart. We need much greater transparency, and we need government to buy goods and services in the interests of the common good, not in the interests of an elite group of shareholders and investment managers which control the finances of some of these very, very large mega corporations which are now out of control and are working in anything but the common good. Education would be another area. We are still teaching the economics in our universities and even in business studies as if the 2008 global recession never occurred. And actually we must mainstream new ways of thinking throughout our education system, because that's where we have the best chance of making some significant difference. Now, coming back to the bigger challenges that government has and using more of the legislation and regulatory framework, of course what we desperately need to do is to legislate for transparency. There has been a lot of progress made in the last decade or so in terms of businesses beginning to clean up their acts, move in socially responsible ways, but they're not moving fast enough. They're not moving with the right motivations, and that's partly because the rewards don't exist in the market. Certainly all businesses over a turnover of say 50 million must be mandated to accurately and transparently report on their ownership structures, on their tax arrangements, on their pay ratios, on their carbon emissions, on their supply chains. There's a whole heap of stuff which really isn't beyond, again, the will of man and women to determine what information we need to have our fingertips in order to make the right decisions about where we spend money as private consumers or indeed as governments. Secondly, pensions. Our pensions, do a lot of harm in the world in your names, and you're the enlightened ones. So we must start adopting models like they have in France along the lines of solidarity pension options, which means that when you are signing up to a pension, you at least have the option of putting your money not into an ethical fund that doesn't do sex, drugs and rock and roll, but actually invests progressively in renewable energy, in housing, in solutions that the world so desperately needs. And actually pensions are very obscure. I've tried to get a kind of a more socially orientated pension. There's not a chance. And actually the ethical pension funds, which aren't as bad as the traditional pension funds, have been outperforming traditional pension funds for a long while. So there isn't necessarily, I'm not asking you to sacrifice your pensions in order to put money in the right place, and government has a key role in driving some of that agenda. So there's a few things that can absolutely be done from a more regulatory and legislative perspective. Transparency, pensions, getting away with tax havens, getting rid of tax havens, right? We have had the leadership in our current government and in the last government talk about the blight that tax havens create, not only in our economy, but particularly on the developing world. They starve the developing world of billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of pounds of really valuable public money that can be used to invest in the infrastructure that those countries are going to need for tomorrow to build themselves in a sustainable and progressive way. So I could go on for hours, but I just want to give you just a few ideas off the top of my head about stuff that we need to see emerge, and not, in 100 years' time, but in 2016, 2017, 2020, and it's going to take citizens actually to demand this stuff. The solutions, I think, we know what broadly they are. It's actually how we get governments to actually mainstream them into their commitments and into their manifestos that will continue to prove the real challenge. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.